Hi there. Thanks for downloading, listening to, and watching the Lean Into Artcast, a show where a couple of visual storytellers get together, think about things that they've been working on, and take that thinking, bring it into a conversation, and think a little harder together. We think hard about this stuff, so you will too. My name is Jerzy Drozd. I am a cartoonist and teaching artist, and the other host is...
Hey, I am Rob Stenzinger, a user experience designer, and I also make video games.
Good to see you again, Rob.
Hi, Jerzy. Good to see you.
Happy holidays, whatever holiday you celebrate this time of year.
Yeah, that's thank you. Happy holidays to you too, and to everyone of the listeners. Lots of folks celebrate, don't celebrate, and that's great. Just hope they're having good days for them and those they care about.
Yeah, I guess that would be like the most inclusive way to say it is good days this time of year. Hope you have good days. It's final show of 2018. And for those who are new to this thing, if this is your first time downloading it, normally we pick a topic every week and crunch really hard on it for about an hour, about a half hour, thinking about it from like, what does it look like when we're engaged with this topic? Like, for instance, if you're saying like penciling comics, what's it look like when you're penciling? And we, show what it looks like or describe what it looks like. And then the second half is like, how do we think about this stuff when we're doing it, or before we're doing it, or after we've done it? But this time we decided to do another Q&A episode, which could become a regular feature on the show, right?
I think so. We have a few different formats that I think we're starting to collect, and Q&A. That's a fine format. I mean, it's one that we've dabbled with, where we would ask leaners for like a curveball back when we did that, and I mean, we've experimented with lots of little things, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. Pretty much any audio format can have a nice dialogue with the audience just by hearing what they're curious about. Works for us too, I think.
Well, I like that it makes it explicitly about the people listening. And yes, it's us interacting with the questions, but they're driving the conversation by picking the subjects. Which I should say at this point too, if you are watching live, you can participate via chat client. You can add some more questions to the list, but we've got quite a few that were provided by you guys, and we thank you very much for that. So with that, is there any other setup that we need to do, or are we ready to dive in, Rob?
Let's see. What was the last? We tried this once before, like a full Q&A. This is like the
episode 250.
So it's 250. Okay, 7 back. Okay, nice. All right. Yeah, I thought that went pretty well, and let's see what territory we cover this time. Let's jump in.
Well, then we'll jump in.
We're done.
For those who never watched the video, go ahead,
watching
Rob.
Dragon Ball, it is what I love to interact with the video during the intro. I don't like to skip the intro. One edition of the DVDs does have I forget what they call it, the marathon play or whatever on the menu, and I ended up missing the intro. I know it's redundant and all that stuff, but it's kind of fun.
Can we make this the first question that we actually address this topic? Because I think this is a fascinating part of entertainment is repetition as a way to build anticipation, right? I'll tell you what I mean. Like in Power Rangers, actually on the new Voltron show, the sequence where they form Voltron is the same animation every time. And the same music plays every time. And in Power Rangers, they did this when they would form the Megazord. In the 2001 Transformers series, Transformers Robots in Disguise, the transformation sequences were drawn once, and they just reused it. In He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, when he says, by the power of Grayskull, it's always the same animation, which sounds like it could get repetitive. But as a child, well, even as a grown-up, there's something that, like, it's like, here it comes. This is the part where the good stuff starts happening, Like, there's this anticipatory thing that happens, and I don't think it's redundant or repetitive at all. Or if it is, it's doing it for a good effect. Would you agree?
I think yes, I totally agree. And I think we are whiffing it, though, where how come we only have one of us dancing during the... like you've at least got to occupy like a powered up DJ role where you're like, I see.
In
and then it works, right? because we're basically forming the Lean into Art Voltron.
Megazord.
Zord.
Yeah. All right. Point taken. That could be one of our resolutions for 2019. But that music signals that we are now officially in the show. So let's start diving in with some questions. Did you get a chance to think about the questions ahead of time, or were we just diving in blank?
Oh, I skimmed them, but
Okay.
but I did not do any extra preparation ahead of time. Other than I know that we have a few that I think were asked on Twitter as well.
Yes, I added those to the
you did.
list. So
Okay,
yes, thank you to the leaners who interacted on Twitter with the announcement and added some more questions to the list. So,
Oh yeah. Well, there you go.
so
I see
let's start
one
in
of them
section
right
one.
at the top.
Yeah. Where do you want? Do you want to pick the first one,
Let's see.
or do you want me to?
Yeah, you pick the first one.
Okay. How about from Nate Marcel asks, this would be an easy one to start with, is when did you first start drawing comics? At what age? What age did you first engage with this medium?
Well, I mean, strictly let's see. I've been illustrating for a long time and purposefully creating juxtapositions of images and text since I was about 5. And then that ramped up quite a bit when I illustrated a book for a family member when I was like between ages 10 to 12. It was like my first big book project. And but it was illustration, it wasn't comics, right? So I would say that I didn't get into actually illustrating comics, and because again, like I would draw comic characters in illustrations, but I wasn't doing sequential art, and I wasn't telling stories with the specific visual vocabulary of comics until probably my mid to late 20s.
Wow.
Yeah, I would say that honestly, the big catalyst was the game project I was on called codenamed Genhanu, and that project was heavily informed by the visual language of comics and making it interactive, and also using comics in game to tell stories instead of having the story sequences be animated. They were just straight up comics presented digital form. So that was but that wasn't until let's see, late 20s. So early 30s. And for you, the answer is quite a bit younger.
Yeah, I was 6 or 7 when I made my first comic book.
Wow.
And it was like all, well, I shouldn't say like a lot of young people. It was an utterly derivative thing where I just took something and changed the name, and now it's my thing, right? There's a Simpsons episode where like an animator visits the school, and like he's showing his cartoon called Danger Dog, and like then it cuts to like the kids all in class afterwards that are all drawing comics, and Nelson has his new character Danger Cat. It's basically that kind of idea. So I don't know if you remember, there was a short film made in the late 70s, which was a parody of Star Wars called Hardware Wars.
Yeah.
And I saw that on television as a young person, and I was so enraptured with the idea of parody. Like, this was like my first real encounter with parody. It was so funny to me. So I did my first comic was a Star Wars parody based on the Hardware Wars parody. So it was basically lifting a lot of the same jokes. The same kind of thing. Like, I think Han Solo's name in Hardware Wars was Ham Salad, and I think mine was Ham Salami, that kind of thing. Chewbacca was like Chewy Tobacco or something like that. It was what a 6-year-old is going to come up with, right? So it wasn't any kind of work of great genius. But the thing I remember most about it was how I learned to conjugate the verb fight, because I remember I was like, I wrote they fought it, and I was corrected by my parents. Like, no, it's they fought. I was like, well, that sounds weird. But then the first comic book I made based on my own characters didn't come along till way later, until 5th grade, when I created Silver and the Periodic Forces, which at the time was called Silver and the Natural Resources. And actually, if you do a search on comicsaregreat.com, there is a post I did called Silver Then and Now, and I actually posted all the pages from that comic I did in fifth grade. Yeah, it was fifth grade. And it was about a silver reptile alien who comes to Earth from outer space, and he has a magic glove that can summon warriors representing each of the chemical elements. And which sounds like, whoa, you were an advanced child for fifth grade. Well, chemical elements, I was pretty fast and loose. Like, there was a guy who was just a cloud. I'm like, a cloud's an element, right? Sky, air, so. But the principle was an interesting idea. It was interesting enough to me that, like, in 2005, I recreated 2 issues of that comic with a friend of mine, Sarah Turner, which you can find at indieplanet.com. So... so that started a long time ago, and it's been my focus ever since. And I want to take a question that Shadowing Tronics put in the chat, because I think this is like a good spin-off of this question. Because he says, the question I'm hoping for is what got you interested in comics/games as a reader/player, and what transitioned you to making them yourselves? So let's talk about games, Rob.
Yeah.
What got you interested in games, and what transitioned you to?
I did not examine this critically until near the time when I started thinking that I might want to try to make a game. And so as far as what got me into games, it's because in just inherent attraction, and they existed, and I had access to them. I remember early childhood, having a relative who bought an Atari 2600, and I was like, oh my gosh, I might have seen a Pong thing earlier, but this is something, right? This is like playing tanks on the screen, or the Atari Combat and the planes, or the Circus Atari, and the different different characters and problems and representations, the interaction, and being able to sort of test yourself and just interact with this magical box. It was fascinating. And so I was a kid who just always, I think to be honest, I was opportunistic about which friends I chose to play with, because I was thinking about, hey, I bet if I go to, one kid's house or another, we might probably play some Nintendo, or play some, and that's, mutual interest and playfulness that was definitely there. But I was all about it. And later on, fast forward, when I was thinking about I think we talked about this certainly in the past, but I was in my early adulthood thinking about, I was working full time and sort of casually studying, well, not very actively studying video games as a hobby, and getting more and more fascinated and picky about them and whatnot. And also thinking about what I wanted to do next as a job or career, or what. I don't know, but it would be a thing to do to get paid that would not be what I was currently doing. And I started to see how maybe video games would work, and continued to study and look at different examples, and how people who didn't have the background in computer science would have an approachable route into creating interactive entertainment. And so I ended up gravitating toward this whole platform called Macromedia Director. It was like Director 8 back in that time. And it's like a predecessor to Flash, if you're familiar with that. But basically it's like, hey, there's this possibility for people who mostly think visually, yet also can think in sort of the logical way that you need to think, as far as structuring data and behavior and experiences that you're going to make into something interactive. And it was a natural fit, and it fit all my different interests, and I was able to sort of find some other friends who were interested in joining me on such an experiment, and I lucked out with that. And that was, that's how so it really was not, aspects of it were very much a fork in the road and thinking I want to go in this direction. But as far as prescriptively what stepping stones I was hitting next, I didn't know enough to know which stepping stones were next, other than to try to figure it out as I went. And I know in general I want to make video games, so that's, I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer, because I think there's a lot more models to follow. Like, so one of the reasons why I started the game company I started was I had a rough idea and I shared it with some friends where I'm like, hey, I don't have funding to start a company, but what if, right? What if you could get a few people of different talents but common interests together, and hey, we could, maybe that would be enough of the different skills required to make a game. Because I was certain that, like, I wasn't going to be able to pick up all those skills quickly enough, whatever. And I had some really, thoughtful, strong critique from a group of trusted friends who were pretty much solidly against the idea. A lot of them had internships at companies and are like, the lead programmer on my project, they've got a mortgage and stuff. They're not going to go joining you on your crazy, you don't know what you're doing quest, right? And it's like, well, yeah, good point.
You don't know what you're doing quest.
So yeah, but at the same, but then fast forward a few months, and literally in Game Developer Magazine, an article that described a company that went about essentially that business model was there. And I was like, all right, that's it. I just, and that's where it's like seeing your ideas, hung about in the world and in a relatable way is powerful. So I think fast forward to now, there's a lot, I think, this is true for any discipline at any time. People are going to be, you're living in your context and your time, and whatever, like your path into something is going to be vastly different than someone's who's already into it and they came from some different time, right?
Sure.
So, because I can't imagine that same shape of events taking place, because now the resources are abundant and it's awesome, and I learned from them too. It's a great,
and it's taught in schools now. Like,
yeah.
Coding is taught in schools now, where that wasn't a thing when you and I were children. And I mean, the context matters in that, like, you have to, like, understand, like, the difference, what that abundance looks like now versus what it looked like before.
Oh my gosh, comics has the same kind of thing, doesn't it? Right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's taught in colleges now. There's there's a variety of different kinds of people involved in the industry now. there's this it's being widely embraced. Like, I honest to God, I just had this conversation with Ann in the car today, coming back from work. I said, like, isn't it wonderful that the argument about the argument for comics as a reading experience is no longer about where are the advocators. Now it's about how are we advocating. Like, we're at that point now where everybody's advocating. Now we're going to argue about the methodology of advocating for comics. And it was based on this idea of, like, both Ann and I get kind of a little sleepy-eyed when we hear people say, well, at least they're reading. At least they're reading something. I'm like, okay. It kind of diminishes comics a little bit. You mean well, but that you could advocate a little better than that. Anyway, no, but I remember the first time I saw a video game, I was at a Cub Scout meeting and waiting for my mom to pick me up or whatever, and the kids were like, all right, while we wait for rides, let's go play Pong. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And I think it's a board game, and suddenly they're interacting with their TV. And, like, it was just like a world shift, right? I was like, wait a minute, the TV's the thing that just does stuff and we just watch it. Right? Like, you're interacting with it. I remember going home and I was talking a mile a minute to my parents. I'm like, you don't understand. They were moving a thing and it moved on the TV, right? Like, that's how crazy that was, right? And so, like, how do you get from, like, I love this thing to how I make this thing when that rift is so big, when the technology is that new and, like, in society still figuring out what it even is. And now it's like, yeah, the path of somebody starting out today is going to be a lot different than it was then.
I think the signals are similar, though. I was just thinking about what you were describing. I think there are, even at that time, there were some resources, right? So I would end up buying magazines like Morph's Outpost on the Digital Frontier and also Game Developer Magazine, right? And then in like what you're describing, there would be adjacent disciplines and stuff that are trying to help people learn the basics and gain experience, right? So I would bet things that had been formalized just like sort of further ahead on the wave of creative disciplines being formalized. So things like children's book illustration, you might end up picking up some things from there, or books on animation and stuff like that. Thinking about visual storytelling in other forms and then applying it to comics. And then with games, I think, I mean, there were like, you had a variety of hobbyist magazines as far as programming. Like growing up, there were like it was almost like programming as recipe, where like the methodology and the pedagogy has improved so much since then. Where literally one of the ways to learn to make a game when I was growing up, coding on an Apple II, Apple IIc specifically, but it would be, you type in stuff from a magazine. you read it and you type it in, and you learn that you can change things that you typed. So in BASIC, you have the lines of code, and you could retype a code line number and give it a different instruction, and then all of a sudden now you've patched or replaced little different, and you're starting to make it your own. And that's one way I started to learn as well.
I remember
it's like adjacent stuff.
Yeah, and I remember at the Scholastic Book Fair in like 4th grade or whatever, they had a book about how to make your own video games, and it was coding for the Commodore 64. It was how to write video games for the Commodore 64. And I do remember it had the instructions written out, and you just copied it and pasted it in. And then it even said, like, well, if you want the game to be shorter, you change this part and add your own parameters. If you want it to be longer, change this part and add your own parameters. And it was all like go to line 6, go, if this, then that kind of thing. So there was some resources at the time that made it like a little bit more available to you. Yeah, comics. It was similarly different in that the industry was a much smaller place. There was essentially at the time, like when I was a kid, really 2 big companies in town. There was DC and Marvel. There were smaller companies like Comico, Now Comics, Eclipse. I'm gonna forget some, but there was Mirage Studios. There was like these small press organizations. Or companies, but the real money was at those 2 big places, and those were both superhero outfits, and they had some other kinds of stories in there, but for the most part, it was all just like capes and tights, as they say. So how did I get to go from? I have a very similar story to yours in that. I remember thinking that I was going to be, like in 11th grade, I was like, I'm going to be the next great Spider-Man artist. Now I'm going to be featured in Wizard magazine. Gareb Shamus is going to be my buddy. He's going to pick me up in his limo. And then I think it was a matter of me not having the skill set. Like I was showing samples at conventions and stuff, and I was getting a lot of feedback, and I don't think I was good enough yet to do superhero stuff at 19. So I got disillusioned very quickly. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a lot more work than I thought it would be. Well, I'll just make my own comics about the stories I want to do, and then I'll get to focus on my strengths and avoid my weaknesses. And started doing mail order zines. I got some addresses, started sending out comics for free to people and asked for their feedback, and then would mail them order forms for more books, and actually began that way.
You had a decent little mailing list there. Didn't you? Remember, I mean, you had dozens of subscribers, right?
I did. Like when I was first starting out, I don't remember what the numbers were. I mean, this is like going back to like 1994, 95. It's a long time ago now. But I remember I had like a filing cabinet drawer full of mail from interactions with people. Like it was all written on paper. We wrote letters, Rob. This is making me feel quite old. Like I remember we hand wrote letters to one another, and like people would send me. It was really gratifying because like I would mail them the comic. They'd send me like $2 in the mail. I'd mail them a mini comic or a digest-sized comic, and I'd get a letter back with them like talking about like interacting with things that happened in my book. And you think about the effort that you had to go through to send a message like that. Like that's like real commitment to something. And back then, too, there were zine review magazines like Fact Sheet 5. What was the other one? There was another one called The Poop Sheet. And it was like you'd mail your mini comics to these people, and they would write reviews of your comic and how to get it. And so that was the other way that my mailing list grew, was through review zines that were circulated around at the time. So the transition is like, kid hobbyist making my own comics on my sharing them at school, to starting mail order zines, and then submitting a few samples to Antarctic Press in the late 90s. And that's how I got my first published gig, which was the Ninja High School swimsuit. Or it was originally called the Swimsuit Special, but I asked them politely, can we please call it a summer special? Because I don't want any of my comics to not be accessible to children. Like swimsuit wouldn't be, but like I remember thinking like, well, that's kind of suggestive, and I'd rather stay away from that aspect of it and focus on like the fun aspect of it. That came out in 1998, so
wow.
And I got money. They gave me money, so that I consider that my first professional work. But it's like 1994 to 90. There was 4 years of me making lots of zines and going to local conventions and sharing them and sending them to review magazines. To build my skill set, like to up my game with each successive book, but then also, have something to show for it when I sent some samples to Ninja High School. Well, here's some of my samples of, me drawing your characters, but here's a bunch of other stuff I've done, right? I had like some kind of, what would you call that? A resume behind me of some sort, right?
Yeah,
but
it's a trail of projects, and
yeah,
that trail of projects, that work tells a story, and it does become your resume or your CV or what have you.
But I don't. The more I think back on that, I don't think of myself as especially gifted or talented in that. It's just that I just sort of single-minded. Yeah. Carrie is in the chat, says portfolio. Yes, thank you, portfolio. There we go. Yeah, it's just that's like literally my top priority from the age of 11 on. That's like everything else seemed like, and it was very. I think we talked about this in some recent episodes. It was really difficult for me as a young person to get on board with learning new things unless you could point at how it would make me a better cartoonist. And in Greg Schiegel and I've had arguments about this where I look back on it and I kind of wag my finger a little bit and going like, well, that's a little selfish, little bit, myopic. There's learning for learning's sake, and maybe that's something you only learn as an adult. But as a kid, it's like, you justify how this is going to make me better at comics. Otherwise, I'm really going to have a hard time getting excited about this thing. And if you could prove that, I would be like really on board, right? So,
how interesting. I wish I had that dedication early on, because I remember being pretty discouraged as far as going along the art path, and two different things. Like I had, let's say I lived in a pretty darn not well-funded way in my late teens, and in my mid to late teens, and I was. And so when I got the message from a guidance counselor in school that in the occupational outlook handbook, right? He was like, well, this is what you can expect as a career, as a commercial artist, right? That was the closest comparable thing that they had in the book. And it was not exciting because it was wages that I could easily get in a variety of other ways. And I was, I don't know, I was pretty lost and puzzled for a while, and I thought, I need to figure this out, but then said, I also don't want to be living this meager anymore. So how do I make a living and continue to figure that out? Hence, eventually ending up on, working third shift to pay the bills, and then working during the day to building up skill and trying to make video games. Failing at that, but then eventually creating enough of a body of work to prove that I understood web technology, and then getting hired to help out to make websites and stuff. That's a short version of it. I mean, did a little bit of consulting before that, and then, got a job essentially doing web tech in corporate. And so then I've kind of always lived this lifestyle of doing something to pay the bills and also become its own thing, right? But that became a giant part of, like, I introduced myself on this podcast as a user experience designer, and I also make video games. And yeah, emphatically both is what I believe and enjoy. And it's just, the path is, that's what works for me. Right. And, let's see. I don't know. I suppose there's a lot to unbox there. I guess I just wanted to point it out where there's not a. I think the huge thing is that there is support whenever you're starting out, and there has been ever since there were the video games and comics. It's just that you would end up finding, I think, you might have to have a little extra scrappiness in the earlier days, but even now the scrappiness is, you need to have it. It just looks a little different. It's like finding the local game development meetups in your community, finding the local comic artist meetups in your community, because now you got to get your work out of your head into the world and also get it into a wider community, because then it's going to become stronger and better. And you will find feedback that is frustrating and difficult, but maybe true. And you need to adapt and grow and learn and explore these things. And you may find other feedback where it's like, do you know what? I think this is the thing that I want to stand for. So actually, thanks for that. I'm going to keep hunting, right? Mm-hmm. But somewhere in there is a process to then continue applying those things and building the skills and then growing it into a series of experiences that then allow you to get gigs.
Yeah. Yeah. My those 4 years that I described when I was making like the zine comics and shipping through the mail, a large part of that growing experience was me going to the Motor City Comic Con twice a year. At that time, it was there was a spring one, an autumn one, and a summer one. So sometime in like June, and then it'd be sometime in like November, October, somewhere in the neighborhood. And I did it twice a year for 4 years, so it's 8 times, and I wound up finding a tribe of other zine-making comics guys there. And there was a lot of like, commiserating, but then there was also a lot of like helpful shop talk, right? Like engaging with that community and finding out, well, how do you handle this part of your business? How do you handle that part? If there's one thing I could do better in my comics, what would it be? And getting that feedback face to face from those kinds of people. Finding the local people to engage with, and most towns have something like that or something nearby. Drink and draws, if you're a cartoonist, is like a big thing that happens. There's one here in Ypsilanti, just next door to Ann Arbor, that happens on a monthly basis. So, I think that's another piece of the puzzle, is that whatever the path is, finding a way to engage with whatever local community so you can get that kind of face-to-face interaction and feedback, I think is awesome. Mm-hmm. At least it helped me a lot. Okay, are we approaching break time before we take on a couple more?
I think so. That was I honestly, I'm happy to dig into a question thoroughly. It's not about quantity. Q&A episodes. It literally may be 1Q, 1A. Who knows? But.
So I just discovered this podcast recently called 10 Things That Scare Me. And it's a pretty fascinating premise for a show where it's just like different people like just talking about 10 things that scare them, and then they can elaborate if they want to. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And I thought that would be a fun thing to do with Rob. And then I thought, 10 things. 2 of us, we can't fit that in an hour.
Next season on Lean Into Art.
Like 10 episodes.
10 things that scare us.
All right. We're going to take a 1.5 minute break to talk about some people who make this show possible, and then we'll come back with some more questions. So the people that we want to thank happen to be the folks who support us on Patreon. Yes, patreon.com/leanintoart is the site. What is it? It is a way for you to give us a monthly upvote. You say, I believe in Jerzy and Rob. I believe in what they do. I find value in what they do. So here's $1 a month. Whatever you can afford. We want to thank 5 people who've been doing exactly that. Becky Hilburn, who you can find on Twitter at NattoSoup. Thank you, Becca. Rachel Ross, longtime friend of the show. You can find Rachel on Twitter at NYC Terrace. And India Swift, another great cartoonist. You can find India's work by going to Twitter and looking up the user Old Swifty. And Nate Marcel, who I believe is in the chat today. Thank you, mate. I mixed Nate and Marcel together. Thank you, Nate, for believing in us and what we do. You can find Nate on Twitter at Great Sea Monster. And finally, Ben Odgren. Thank you, Ben. You can find Ben on Twitter at Ben Odgren. You can join them all at patreon.com/leanintowart, where you'll find all the shows that we produce, as well as the extra leans, the shows we record only for people who support us on Patreon. And those posts become an open mic where you can talk about whatever you want, a safe place only where only other leaners are hanging out. And let me say, if you haven't checked out Patreon yet, you can cancel it at any time. You can just check in for a month, do like a 1 month donation, and then you can avail yourself of all of the behind the scenes content there in that month. And you can come back when you can afford it. So we want to thank everybody who has been doing exactly that thing. Oh, so Carrie Bushin Girl is saying something in the chat about this, and I want to read it first before I read it on the air.
I have a surprise. Anyway.
Yeah. If anyone watching now doesn't follow or contribute on Patreon, it's totally worth it. Such a wonderful and supportive community and consistent learning and inspiration. Thank you, Carrie, for saying that. Now, there you go. There's an unsolicited testimonial. But, I mean, seriously, the extra leans, not to drag this thing on too long, but the extra leans, if you haven't checked them out, is like me and Rob sort of like just turning on the mic and just going. Like we often don't even know we're going to be doing it until, like, Rob says, "Oh, I'm recording, by the way." So.
Yeah. And Nate comments that he is also on Patreon. We know. Thank you, Nate.
Patreon/Nate.
Yeah. Oh, and literally on Patreon. Okay, I get it. Yeah, awesome. Right on. Yeah, it's a whole community of artists that that are seeking sort of. It's like a patronage marketplace. Instead of getting a grant from the Knight Foundation, it's a lot less process and less risk too. So anyone can be a patron.
Yep. Okay. It's time for me to hit some music to go to the next part of this thing. So how about I go dun dun dun. I've used this one before, right, Rob? No?
Huh. It's interesting. It's crunchy and upbeat.
It's from one of the very first conversations you and I had in person, where you had the misfortune of mentioning Galaxy Rangers.
Oh, it's Galaxy Rangers. Is that the closing credits of Galaxy Rangers?
Yes, that was the closing credits.
Huh. All right.
That was my ringtone for the longest time. I don't know, but that song just fills my heart with happiness. Okay, second half of the show. So, can we keep this theme rolling with like this? These questions are naturally snapping together, and I'm wondering what you think of Carrie's question about conventions.
I think it's fantastic. I think there's a lot of angles on it. So, to put Carrie's question out there, she asks, "What are the major cons you normally attend?" So, yeah, lots of conventions out there, and I mean worldwide. That's kind of awesome, but can be daunting. And I mean, even just nationwide, even just locally. I mean, I notice when I have had more plans to do more conventioning, and either even visiting or tabling or what have you, and I have a vastly wider perspective that I know that. I know you've done this kind of experimenting too, Jerzy, where it's like when you go to a convention, that could mean a lot of things. That doesn't mean always, half a table, full table, what have you, right? Artist alley, vendor, whatever. It could mean a lot of different things, but gosh, there's a lot of East Coast. Darn events that you have, which is wonderful, and I'm happy for you. But there are definitely some fine events in the middle of the U.S. But
Midwest is getting better. But yes, it's easier on the East Coast and the West Coast, I would say, of the United States. Yeah. So, but what about like because you also do other kinds of events like IO, which I have not attended yet, but I've come to Minnesota to hang out with you during IO.
That's funny. So
That's more like a conference, I guess.
that's a good point. So there are conferences too. So there, having like the purely, so like A2CAF has evolved or has always had this essence of where you've made it about professional development on top of uh, the traditional networking and sales and having a well met connection with a particular audience that you're part of a community that serves and all that. It's but there's also the professional development, and yeah, I go to I have the fortune, I have a day job that sponsors my attendance at some things, so my opinions are my own and all that. Day job lawyers, but it's honestly it's a wonderful privilege, and I feel fortunate for it. But that's one of the reasons why I've been able to attend things like IO consistently, right? Because I mean, something like that, it's IO is so awesome. They have a variety of like they have like patron models and like what do they call it? Scholarships and like volunteering, and there's different ways to like and lots of conventions have the volunteering angle, but I know IO has got like a lot of extra ways to make it possible or affordable for people in different situations. But there's always that. I think that's just I don't know, some context I need to share is that like I attended IO this year. I also attended Hackaday SuperCon, and that was awesome too. Like IO, I've talked about year after year, shared so much love about it. It's essentially a conference that's the merging of like design and data and ethics and making sharing projects and situations that the projects serve that are fascinating and inspiring and across a variety of disciplines. And so the awesome thing about IO also, if you can't attend live, a few months after the event, they do post the videos on what's that
the video
site? Vimeo, yeah. So yeah, Vimeo is still around, yay! And all the IO videos are there from past events. Super awesome stuff. I highly recommend checking them out. Just do some surfing, see what gets your curiosity up. But then like Hackaday SuperCon, that's more about hands-on electronics and whatever, and that's a thing I've been studying and trying to gain greater vocabulary for, because I'm designing experiences related to that now, and I need that. I need that because of my approach to design. I like to have some level of fluency in any medium that I'm creating, designing solutions and user experiences for. They're all hypotheses that'll be stronger if I understand what I'm designing with. So yeah.
So,
anyway.
not to get pedantic about this, but I wonder if it'd be useful to back up and sort of like create buckets of why these different events, conferences, festivals, conventions matter to us. What purposes do they serve? Because I go to a variety of different kinds of events for very different reasons. So, like every year, not every year, but almost every year, I do a small craft show in Ann Arbor called Tiny Expo. It's a one-day event. It's a local arts and crafts show where it's like people who make, paper crafts, poster art, baskets, jewelry, you name it, like things that you'd find on Etsy. And then one of the reasons I like to go to that is because I'm the odd duck in that I'm the one guy making comics there, so I'm the only comics table, and I wind up selling very well at that show. I make a decent amount of money in a single day at that event. So that show's all about selling. Right, that's the show I go to specifically because I know I'm going to make good money at the show. Then there's shows I go to because it's professional development. Like for instance, I go to things like CXC, the Cartoon Crossroads Columbus in Columbus, Ohio, and TCAF in Toronto, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, because they're fun events that really I think celebrate comics in a way that I find very gratifying, and it harmonizes with my worldview. But they have these professional development days where they do like demonstrations and talks with professional cartoonists, like people like Seth or somebody like gosh, I'm blanking on her name, Lynn Johnston. Of Better or for Worse, does like a talk and a demonstration. And then there's even like people leading discussions on how to teach comics, right? So like there's like a learning component in there for me as well. And then there's shows that I go to because the social component, right? This is a show that I go to because a lot of my friends go to this show, and it's a way to catch up with everybody. And as Raina Telgemeier once said, is like binging on your buddies, right? You have one weekend where you just like spend a lot of time together, and because you're only going to see them like once or twice that year. So did I capture? Are there any more buckets to capture? Like, there's the social component, the professional development component, and the selling component.
Yeah, I think there might be sort of a couple of buckets for the selling aspect, where if you're there as a vendor, you may be there to primarily sell, but you also may be there to market. And so
yeah, that's good point. Yeah.
So sales and marketing, or sales or marketing, some combo.
Right. It could be that a lot of editors that you want to talk to are going to be at this show. Publishing houses, right? Say like you think like a Small Press Expo, another really terrific show if you're an independent cartoonist. You're not going to talk to publishers there because it's a small press expo. So there are no publishing tables there. But at TCAF, you're going to find First Second, it has representation there. Fantagraphics has representation there. So there's people that you can actually talk to face and show your work to.
Well, and I think there's a couple of kinds of deals you may be looking to make. So you could throw that in a business development bucket, and that may be primarily to strike up some kind of deal or partnership for representation or sales or publishing deal, whatever, right? But that's like a business deal, or possibly one that's finding and hiring collaborators or being hired as a collaborator.
Another one I would put in the professional development bucket too is I have gone every year to Nerd Camp Michigan, which is it's a conference for teachers primarily, but they also have an author track where they have like a whole bunch of authors from the area. I wouldn't say just necessarily local authors, because people come from like Toronto and Chicago to this thing, and it's an unconference where you brainstorm a bunch of ideas on an idea board, and then there's breakout sessions where people just lead. So I attended one session where it was picture books that explore representation by not gendering their protagonists, right? Which I thought, wow, that's a fascinating idea. Are there books in existence that do that? Sure enough, a librarian was there with a whole bunch of picture books that showed like protagonists who could be either gender, because they never name what gender they are. And so like it's a more inclusive kind of storytelling, and sort of like thinking aloud about like what are the implications of this, and how could this be applied to different media. So things like that. So I go to this event primarily because I want to listen to the conversations that teachers are having, because as we've talked about on the show, a way I like to think about networking is listening to the conversations and listening for the ways I can help. And then when the way that I can help reveals itself to me, I offer it. But then also knowing what conversations are happening in the educational world, as somebody who wants to make comics for the people that those people are serving, I want to know what kinds of challenges they're facing on the ground with the students. So I guess if I were to reverse engineer this, I would say, like, if you can identify who your target audience is, are there professional development events, conferences that are about serving that audience? And can you attend it so that you could listen and hear how people are coming up with their own strategies to engage with it and what the challenges are?
I think one more I would add to that is this is probably professional development scenario plus or whatever, and it'd be adding teaching and or performing. So you've been an MC at various events, and you've taught obviously at tons of places, right? And then that's actually something I look for as well. Is this a community that I can potentially share a workshop with, or some kind of little talk or something? and it doesn't. There's not always a fit. It's not like that's the only criteria, but that is one reason that sometimes I go to events.
Yeah, yeah. A model of how my thinking works and how it takes action in these kinds of events is at one of the very first Nerd Camp events, there was a little bit of an overflow of, they do another event called Nerd Camp Junior where they, Colby Sharp and the folks at Nerd Camp are so wonderful. I just have nothing but just bags and bags of respect for these people because they bus kids in from rural areas where they don't necessarily have a lot of access to authors, to presenters, maybe don't even have like a robust art program at their school, right? Very out of the way areas. They bust these kids in and give them a free evening of like small classroom experiences with like celebrated authors, right? So like Jared Krasaska, Dave Pilkey. Like they flew in Dave Pilkey, right? So that he could lead some like little sessions with kids. Think about what that would mean to you as like a 10-year-old, right? And there was like in one of the very first years, there was like this issue with like they had more kids than they had accommodations for, and so Colby, the guy who runs the program, says like, Jerzy, can you just put something together really quick right here and now in the cafeteria? I'm like, sure thing. And I put together a quick draw, which we lead at A2CAF every year, and I grabbed Ruth Barshaw and a couple other authors, and we just quickly did this little game show drawing, competition in front of these kids. And it was a big hit. The kids had a really good time, and like it helped with the whole negotiating where the kids were going to be and when, and it was educational for the kids because when I do the quick draws, I walk through the process. I'd like talk with the artists while they're drawing to like sort of look for the teachable moments for the kids. And Colby was like, well, that was awesome. Can you do that next year? And I said, I'll do it any year you want. And now it's this staple of Nerd Camp Junior. The kickoff event is they put me in an auditorium. You can see pictures on Facebook of it. If you do a search for Nerd Camp. And like they put in like 1,600 kids in this auditorium, and we put on this gigantic game show. And this last year, this past summer, it was me and Judd Winnick and Ruth Barshaw and Travis Jonker, and it was awesome. It was such a good time. But it all began with like just listening for where you can help, and then just offering it and just doing your best. And then if it clicks, it doesn't always click. I've shown up and said, how can I help? And then I try to do the thing. I'm like, oh, that wasn't very good. But when it clicks, then it can turn into something really like profound and,
well, and so you're describing a situation too, where you were connected to that community long enough where you were asked, right?
Yeah.
And so that's that's like a really high fidelity connection, and like you can build a strong conversation from there because you're being recognized by a community as a potential someone who can serve with this particular need. And so there's a lot of ambiguity that is clarified pretty fast, right? As opposed to this general excitement and willingness to help and all that. So that's sort of that's a pretty great way to connect there. And then that happened not overnight. I mean, you've been
Colby and I had been interacting for the last couple of years because he is a Michigan teacher. He had been to A2CAF. He had seen what that event is all about. Mm-hmm. But then also just like when I see something happening that I think is valuable and contributing positively to a community, I just make a habit of showing up and make sure that I'm seen. Like the Cartoon Crossroads Columbus convention in Columbus, Ohio it is an out of this world comic convention. It's pushing all of the buttons in the right way for me. And so I have been to every one since it began. So it's 5 years now. And I don't even know how I can help yet. I just keep showing up. And I keep thanking the event organizers and like, oh my God, this is an incredible event. Thank you guys so much for putting this on. I wish all conventions were like this, that kind of thing. So when I find the moment where they're like, hey, can somebody do such and such? I can go, I can help, and maybe they don't necessarily know what my expertise is or like what kind of event I can lead, but I'm at least a familiar face. It was shown that I'm invested in their success, right? Like I'm going to keep showing up to this thing as long as you guys keep putting it on. So I don't have a strategy. I don't have like a tactical plan. It's just like this is good, and I want to be near that all the time. That's my MO. And I mean, I feel the same way about TCAF. TCAF is a little harder because it's a little bit of a longer trek. It's an international trek. So you have to go into Canada, and it's an expensive trek. It's like hotel and table. TCAF tables are what are they like almost $400. So tabling at that show is a little bit more expensive. Shows like Tiny Expo. This is another contributing factor. Is like Tiny Expo. The tables are free. So that makes, and it's local. It's like in my hometown, so it's like cost me next to nothing to go to that show. So if it's really expensive, it makes it harder for me to keep that signal alive. So I've only been to TCAF a couple times. SPX I haven't been in a while, but that's another show where it's like if I could afford to go there more often, I would be there a lot more. So let's see. TCAF, just to answer the question point blank, TCAF SPX is really good. I would go to them more if I could. CXC is an absolute must. A2CAF, obviously, because I co-organize it. Nerd Camp is an absolute must, and for me. And then another one that I do on a semi-regular basis is the Michigan Reading Association Conference, which is another teaching conference. And I go, this will be my second time there, but it's just like another like Nerd Camp. It's like there's breakout sessions with presentations on how to get books into readers' hands. And then the American Library Association Conference, I went for a number of years to that, which is they've recently begun to embrace comics at the event, and they have an actual artist alley where you can. Last time I went, the table was free, but you had to pay your own way to get there. But the environment is different in that because it's a library conference where traditionally big publishers show up to give away galley copies or pre-pub copies of their books. A friction point I ran into was a lot of librarians would come to your table and just expect everything to be free, and they would just like start picking things up because like that's the culture there, right? You got Penguin books over there, and you just like fill a bag, literally just like walk up with a tote bag and just like scoop books in. So there's a little bit of a cultural tension in that they would pick up the book and I'd be like, whoa, 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 whoa. And they'd be like, oh, it's not free. Oh, and they'd put it back down.
Oh.
But there was also like people would show up and they would actually be buying books for their library. So people would buy, like when we were there with the Warren Commission report, it's like, I'm buying 5 copies for my library. Well, that's awesome. Right. So we just made 5 sales on one person. Great. So.
Let's see conventions that I would go to besides the ones that are professional development. Of course, A2CAF as often as I can. It's a great event. Then there's and so that's like comics, but I mean I go there for video games, and that's a hybrid of to provide value via workshop. Providing workshop type of an experience, and then also to table representing my games and comics, and then that's and then I dabble in like local events around in my area, the Minneapolis area of Minnesota, and there's the events keep happening, but there's a little bit of, like things get renamed, things evolve, things morph and change. There isn't like a tent pole event that really I've found is like the one I make sure I get to every year. But like one on my radar I'm curious about is VGM Con, and that's coming up I think in February. And that's I think that's put on by the same organizers of Gamers Rhapsody. And that was a really cool convention. That's like this really kind of emphatic combination of both the music of video games, but then also video games as an art form. And there's a lot of cross pollination among these different events where I'm at, where there's a lot of involvement with different commonly seen orgs and educational institutions, the Independent Game Developers Association, stuff like that. So I kind of follow those signals and look for things that are local because they're a lot more affordable to attend. My because I just out of excitement and passion, whatever, like the first convention that I tabled at for my comic, back in, what was it, 2009, I think, or 10, I forget. What it was, the Baltimore Comic Con, and I just was like, well, I've budgeted for this. I'm gonna jump in and learn. And I brought, I set up, different products and all that stuff. So attending a convention with the intention to sell things, I mean, that's a whole series of stuff to work through and to consider as far as your space and what might the audience be like there, and is there some impression you have that it's really compatible with like independent work, or is it primarily about the big national stuff, big brands? Or is it a mix? And that's fine. That's a lot of that's going on too. I mean, year after year, it feels like things blend a little bit more among communities, and there's less of a severe boundary of like, well, this is only about, such and such event is only about, TV stars and, the biggest comic book characters that everyone knows, right? Even places like that, it seems to somewhat support independent efforts, but overall not as strong as your independent conventions where that's their focus. So of course that's the community they draw. Let's see.
Right.
Yeah,
So I've done some of those traditional comic shows. I did air quotes, traditional meaning harkening back to a lot of mainstream pop culture's assessment of what comics are. Superheroes, superhero movies, television, science fiction television actors, and horror movie icons. They could have the Batmobile in the building, that kind of thing. I went to Terrificon this year, which was a fun show, but it was aimed more squarely at that audience. Right? I think we talked about it on the LIA Cast. Like, to get to where the artists were, you had to go through this gigantic vendor area where it was mostly people selling T-shirts and toys and things like that. So the people who came to the comic section, like they, I don't know what's in people's hearts, but so I'm not going to say what they were really there for, but it was less people seemed interested in browsing the tables in the artist alley. There was less like people in search of something, but the people who did show up were very, very delighted and surprised by what they found. Like, we had two actually Air Force pilots come to our table because they saw the rockets cover, right? And they're like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this existed. This is cool. We're really, really into aviation, so we'll take 5 copies." It was a very fun and very joyous moment for everybody involved when that interaction happened. But at a show like Tiny Expo, where everybody's there to discover, you have that interaction a lot more frequently. It happens like every 10, 15 minutes. You get this interaction with somebody's like, "Oh, this is wonderful. There's a comic about cats and boats." But on the other hand, there's also like, what am I trying to say? Not on the other hand. I guess what I'm trying to say is like, a thing I look for when I look at what conventions I want to do is what community is gathering around this thing. And you can deduce part of that by just seeing who's like on the ticket, who's tabling, who's presenting at this thing. So yeah, if you look at an SPX, it's going to be a certain group from a certain community of the comics world, and it will have its own kind of diversity within that group, right? I'm not going to say it's not homogenized by any means, but it's like there's some commonality in the types of material that they create. And at Kineticon, it was mostly artists and writers whose work, the work they're most known for is stuff from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, right? So they're still doing stuff, but like the height of their popularity, like Larry Hama, who wrote every issue of G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero comic series, and wrote all of the profiles on the backs of the action figure cards, right? A legend. He's still writing G.I. Joe now, right? But like G.I. Joe isn't as popular now as it was, say, in 1986. So, and so the demographics are naturally very different. New York Comic Con, man, that's an intense, gigantic show, right? Like San Diego Comic-Con. And while it was a wonderful experience, I don't know that I would rush to go back to that because it's almost too much for me. 'Cause it's so many people. Oh, did I say Kineticon? I'm sorry, Troy. Thank you for the correction. I meant Terrificon, not Kineticon. Kineticon is more about internet culture and anime. Thank you, Shadowwing, Troy. I appreciate the clarification. Didn't let me get away with that. Terrificon. I don't know. Is there anything else to say about this whole idea of like why we choose the conventions that we choose, the conferences we choose?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I think we covered it all. It comes down to like, what are your goals, and find those conventions that seem to have a strong signal that seems like they could serve what you need to do, like wherever you're at. Whether that's yeah, and if you're going to engage with it, attending, or only going to the side events, things that have the meetups outside, or if you're going to or if you're going in there in some kind of, well, okay, you're going to sell, are you selling a performance or some kind of service, or are you literally selling stuff you made at a booth and all that? There are a lot of variables. I mean, conventions are a big, I think, an influential format for getting your business out there, as far as like, they take up a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of planning, a lot of resources.
And I think a lot of advice that you'll hear from a lot of different people is start local. See what you can get to within an afternoon's drive. Maybe not dive into doing a San Diego Comic-Con booth your first time out.
Yeah.
I think the research is easier now than it was 20 years ago, in that there's like webcomic chat groups, like different groups on like Facebook, where you can like ask people like, okay, maybe you have some people that you talk to on a regular basis in that group. Ask them. So I went to the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo for the first time this year upon insistence from my friend Zach Giolongo, who does work that is very harmonious with mine. We speak to very similar audiences. And he said, "Oh, I have a terrific time at this show. It's really well organized, and I sell pretty well at this show." And I was like, "Okay, well, I'll finally go." And he was right. I had a wonderful experience there. But I had like a really, really trustworthy recommendation on that. I've made less informed decisions in the past and regretted it, in that like one year I went to the Wizard World Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, and it was basically just based on the numbers. I looked at attendance numbers, said like, look how many people go to the show. Law of averages, if only 20% of the people there are into what I'm doing, I'll do well. Yes, if you could start with that analysis, but then, yeah, I didn't think it through very carefully, because the majority of that audience was there to meet movie stars and TV personalities and check out the latest, latest material from people who are working at Marvel and DC. It was a much harder sell for me at that show, and I spent a lot of money to
And
get
it was
there.
long
and be
distance.
there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was guessing too. So if you have one of those, so it's all about, I mean, be thoughtful about your goals and the risks and all that, right? Where if you have like a Wizard World in your backyard, the risk goes down quite a bit.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
if the risk, especially if you're saying if you're going there to network and attend, or, a low investment. If you're going local and a higher investment, well, there's more risk then. Okay, you got to get a table, all that, but a lot of variables. But that's where, I mean, where invest the time to think it through enough. It's Unless you're in the situation of you just need to jump in and get the experience, and you have a free local event, just go for it. I mean, the worst you're out an afternoon, or what have you. It's worth. That's great low cost research to just go for.
yep, yeah. Motor City Comic Con, when I was first starting out, was a 2-hour drive for me. So, and while I did have to get a hotel, I was 19 years old, so I just got a lot of buddies to go with me, and we all just chipped in on a hotel. So it was a relatively inexpensive show. And actually, back then, Artist Alley tables were free. They were free. Oh my gosh, what a novelty! So it was very inexpensive to go to that show when I was first starting out, and that was really, really good research. Trying out different table setups, different ways of presenting the work, different ways of engaging and interacting with people. So yeah. Okay. Well, are we at final thought time?
Yeah, I think so. Should we try to pick one more question for a final thought, or is there a final thought size question, or that
Good question.
we can really?
Well, I mean, Carrie also had in here. I'll highlight. Oh, you're highlighting something in the chat or in the
Part of
notes.
that's just I poke around. I
Okay.
find that one interesting. That's all.
Oh,
We're basically
well,
talking about what we're looking at in a Google Doc. What? Yeah. This is the one I thought was a natural question for.
Okay. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to take one more break, and we come back. We're going to answer another question from Carrie. That is, what new and exciting projects could be in the works for 2019? Well, we'll talk about that after we take a quick break. We want to thank some more people who make the show possible. Those people happen to be us. We make the show possible. We make stuff all the time, and in the making of the stuff, we encounter all sorts of frictions and challenges and new ways of thinking, and we bring that to this very project, the Lead Into Art Cast. And the thing I hope you will check out that I made recently is a book called Science Comics Rockets. Actually, I worked on this book with my wife, Anne. Came out in June of this year. And if you go to sciencecomicsrockets.com, you'll see where our upcoming appearances are going to be for the book. And so, I mean, the Rockets tour will also be like basically my statement of what conventions I'm doing this year. But the book's in stores everywhere. And what is it? It is a comics documentary about the history and science of rockets as told by the animals who participated in rocket history. So if you're looking at the website right now, you'll see there is a rooster and a duck in spacesuits. Well, they didn't literally do extravehicular activity in spacesuits, but the very first animals to ride in a human-made flying machine were a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. And they become narrators of this book, along with grizzly bears, tortoises, rats, pigeons. All these animals interacted with rocket history in some way, and you will learn how rockets work, and you will learn more about the different ways that they have been used in human history, from entertainment to warfare to exploration, and so on. ScienceComicsRockets.com. If you purchase the book, a really, really wonderful thing you could do is write a review on Amazon or Goodreads. That helps more people find the book. And it sends a message to my publisher saying, like, hey, a lot of people really like this thing. We should let him do more books. That would be nice.
That would be awesome, because the humor you bring to the topic, it's so fun, because it's both. It's like you're laughing and just learning, or even getting reacclimated. So if you're an adult reading through this, and even if you program video games or whatever, you have familiarity with physics, but it's like these are fun examples that, like, maybe you can riff off them and share them as ways to teach some really useful concepts, and then obviously rockets are awesome, and that sells itself. So
it's a subject that Anne and I are both very passionate about, and I think that passion came through in the book. Greg Schiegel described it as joyous. It's like a joyous explosion. Like you feel more excited about rockets reading it. And I also say, and I know this is risking immodesty, I think it's the funniest thing with my name on it. I think it's a really funny book. And it's full of these anecdotes about unknown stories of animals in rocket history. So you also get that, like, put in your pocket all these little, like, oh, did you know? We're all celebrating the orbit of Apollo 8 going around the moon around this time 50 years ago. But the very first animals, or the very first beings from Earth to orbit the moon, were 2 Russian tortoises. That kind of thing. So you also get to be that guy or that gal at a party if you read Science Comics Rockets. Lots of value baked into this book. Speaking of value, Rob, you make a game.
Yeah, I do. It's called This Panda Needs You. The situation is you might need this panda as well, where you're looking for a mellow puzzle game. You're looking for a mellow puzzle game that's about just stacking shapes and matching patterns. And whether that's for you or for a young one in your life, it's fantastic, because it runs on all sorts of different platforms. And the gist of it is you're helping this cute little panda stack blocks. And these blocks come in really simple patterns to start out, right? And the blocks are fine, and then a cloud knocks them all down, and here you are. You're able to drag them and stack them and put them all back to the way they should be. And I said they start easy, but then it gets more and more complex as you go. There's like over 50 levels. Things get more challenging, more shapes, more colors, and it gets to be kind of challenging, managing them all, making the space to get them restacked and all that. It becomes a skill that you can easily learn by playing This Panda Needs You. And you can do this on a variety of platforms, on your iOS devices, your iPhones and iPads, your Android phones and tablets, and actually your Windows and Mac desktops. And you can learn all about all these different links where you can easily jump to them at this-panda.com.
And if you have purchased it, giving it a review wherever you purchased it helps more people find it. But let's say that you're here because, you know, you're very proud of us that we make stuff, and you pat us on the back and say, good job, you two. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here for the way you guys think about stuff. That's fair enough. This show is a product that we make as well, and there's more self-contained products like it at leanintoart.com/workshops, where you can download self-contained videos about various topics we teach at a price of your choosing, even free. And if you get some value out of it, a neat thing you could do is then purchase it for a friend, and then that's like giving us a tip for the thing that we provided for you that has some value for you. If you're watching the video on YouTube right now, giving it a thumbs up helps more people find the show. And if you're listening to it in a podcatcher like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, giving it a 5-star review wherever you listen to it helps more people find the show as well. And we thank everybody who has been doing that for us. It means a lot to us. It really does.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
All right. Final thought. What new and exciting projects could be in the works for 2019?
How well planned out is your 2019 project list, Jerzy?
All planned out. Well,
yeah.
I mean, I have a book that I'm under contract on for the next Captain Seriously book that has to be done right away. That's like the next thing I'm diving into, and so that's gonna be the first month and a half of 2019. That's spoken for with that. And so that's not something that's like for public consumption. It's for like a specific city. The city of Chelsea gets this comic when I'm done. And it's for the 10th grade. It's the 10th grade book. So I've been doing a new book every year for this school since 2nd grade. And slowly aging it up has been like a really big and exciting challenge. But what I'm hoping to do with the spring, so like we're talking like late February, early March, is I think we talked about this in the last episode. I want to invest in some product development. What that means is writing some pitches. Pitches being a couple pages of written text describing the essence of what the book could be. Book, graphic novel, that's what I mean. Followed by like an outline of what the first book could look like. And then 5 to 10 sample pages from the book. Here's what the art and writing will look like in action in the book. I would really like to do 2 or 3 of those in the spring so that by summertime I have something to shop around. So new and exciting projects, yes. Is it something that the world is going to see right away? Probably not, because the pitches, let's suppose, best case scenario, a publisher says in July, oh my gosh, we want to do Baron von Baron, the 7 Deadly Statues, whatever I come up with, right? I go, that's great. Let's get to work on it. Well, now we've got, 6 months to 8 months of, waiting for the contracts to be written up, negotiating the contract, setting a date for the publication of the book. And then we got a year, maybe 15 months of me writing and drawing the book. And then maybe another 8 months to a year before the book comes out. So best case scenario, I sell a book in July of 2019. It'll be like 2021, 2022 before we see it. So kind of a drag, right?
If that's news, then yeah, the first few times you hear that's like, oh gosh, I have to wait that long.
Yeah.
It's hard when you first hear that. But not that I've done such a book deal, but I listen and I'm adjacent to lots of folks who do this kind of thing, and yeah, that's how the business works. And it's just, I mean, speaking of risk, right? I mean, that's a lot of risk to essentially take on all yourself, right? So instead of doing 3 pitches, right, and the amount of work it would take to do them, if you said, I'll develop all 3 projects and then see what happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
well, I mean, and
different deal.
And I am doing that with the comic I'm working on with Dan Michigan called Amazon Academy, which is at amazonacademy.net. So that will continue. I mean, weekly updates with pages of the comic, seeing if we can build an audience for that. So that was something where it's like we're trying to do the model where you build the audience first and then sell the project. So I'm trying a variety of ways to get things working for me.
Yeah, so that's cool. So you have a project that's filling that particular business model. So
Yes.
Right. It might be to have all projects occupy that same business model. It would be like a lot of risk. And it sounds like you're mitigating some of that risk where it's not taking up all your capacity. You're not saying
Right.
whole life is Amazon Academy right here, right now.
Well, not to fall down the rabbit hole of talking about reflection and journaling and ETP again, but I have a very, very good sense of what a page of comics, penciling, lettering, inking, coloring costs me. And so I can say like, okay, I can budget, 12 hours a week to work on a passion project like this. And that won't intrude upon anything else that I have to do to keep the lights on. One more thing I will say that I'm starting to think more about for 2019 is I would like it if I made at least one new mini comic a year. Mini comic meaning an 8-page self-contained story, whether it's about Baron von Bear or another Captain Cat book or a Boulder and Fleet book, that remains to be seen. But I have been kicking around the idea of doing a Boulder and Fleet short story where they encounter the mercenaries from my old graphic novel, The Front Rebirth. And anybody who's been paying attention to my work for a long time will remember in that story there were these 4 guys who were kind of they were not sinister villains. They were more goofy villains. There was Dick Courage, who was like this gadgeteer type character with talking guns. And then there was Torpedo Black, who could, when he had these pieces of armor on his shoulders, and when he flew, they would all link up, and he'd be like literally a flying torpedo. And then there was Jared, the Abominable Snowman, who is he him behind me? Oh, he's not up there right now. Oh, he's not. Oh, he's behind the little. It's kind of hard to see. Anyway,
I see. Oh yeah, I see Jared actually. This is an exercise for someone who chooses to view the video on YouTube.
But Jared, the Abominable Snowman, is
there's also Wampuses up there, right? So anyway, I just revealed a clue. Anyway.
Yeah, you're right. But Jared is an Abominable Snowman who wears pants, and Orange Guy is this orange He-Man / demon guy with leather pants, and they're best friends. And I thought, like, what? I wouldn't have to change Jared and Orange Guy to put him in Boulder and Fleet. They could stay exactly the same, but Dick and Torpedo Black would have to become animals. What animals would they be? And I started doodling around with this like last year. And I was thinking, like, that would be a fun story to do where these 4, they're 4 mercenaries for hire in the woods, and they come across our adventurers for hire. That would be a fun story to try out. Not committed to it yet, but I'm at least committed to the idea of doing one new mini comic next year at some point. Maybe not for Inktober. Maybe actually just do it like a page here, a page there. And then Ann and I are also working slowly, and I posted this on my Patreon earlier this year. We're very slowly making progress on a series of mini comic stories of stuff from Science Comics Rockets that didn't make it into the book. So more stories of forgotten or not well known stories of animals in Rocket history. So like when we go to shows with Rockets, we'll also have like, oh, here's 3 mini comics that also are like addendums to the book.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Can't wait to hear about those stories.
What about you?
Well, I am working on my goal planning process and making progress as December ticks on. I think I'll be in a pretty good position, but let's say early January to feel more strong about some of the things on this list. But things on the list that are of strong potential for 2019, TBD. Some of them will, are building on work that started like a year. Well, let's say 12 to 14 months ago. So like the 2 Pizza Team project, where it's a hypothesis of both game and comic. I intend to get some sort of draft of the game done this year. We shall see. And then I would like to do another mini comic related to it. I have a few other game experiments, things that would be less, I mean, really just all about being a game. So like maybe iterating on things like Guitar Fretter, or iterating on, some of the algorithms and things in This Panda Needs You, turning it into something else, that kind of thing. Things that would be less effort to produce than an entirely new game, and also have this parallel path, just practicing in Unity, and just developing low risk things to help contribute to the higher risk thing, TBD. But like single screen, not complex, just tiny game experiments. Then let's see. I have a few small product experiments on my, on my backlog, things that are partially developed. And, one of those is something I'm collaborating on with you, Jerzy. We'll see, right? 2019, who knows? There's a few others on that list as well. Not going to talk about them publicly until I'm ready, but they're small product experiments. The idea being that they probably could, with like a really productive set of evenings and maybe a weekend, a week or two, they could probably have a decent draft into the world. We'll see. And some of those small product experiments relate to iterating on like my existing workshops. So we'll see. And then there was something that I was developing a bit, pretty much out in the open during Art Sound Off, where I've been practicing gathering new ideas and material and stuff related to teaching user experience and advocating for it as a practice for anyone who needs to use these tools of systemic-minded, human-centered design. And that's the list. It's too big, so it's way too big.
Yeah.
It will not all happen in 2019, but that's what the planning process is for. I need to weed this down, whittle, and focus.
Yep. That's the first couple weeks of next year is the self-meeting. And that's what's on my docket too, is to sit down and say like, well, let's throw down all the items and figure out where they can all fall in the year, and what can't happen. Fun. We get to do it all over again.
Yeah, I love it. We get to.
Yeah. We get to.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think we did a podcast, Rob.
I think so too.
I think we did another year of podcasting, and thank you to everybody who has been showing up to the chat room and interacting with us and offering, great food for thought for us to chew on the show, supporting us on Patreon. 2018 was pretty okay, the large part thanks to you. At least as far as the Lean Into Art cast is concerned. I'm not going to speak about other aspects of living. I can't speak to that. But as far as doing this project,
keeping the scope focused here. Yes.
Yes.
Lean Into Art and surrounding community. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. And we'll see you. Here's to another year. So we record the show every Thursday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central. We stream it live on YouTube and then collect it as a podcast at patreon.com/leanintoart and leanintoart.com. And, yes, you're very welcome, Nate. I sent Nate something in the mail for his kid who was reading Science Comics Rockets, and I'm really glad that he enjoyed it. Both Ann and I drew it together for him. So, okay, where was I? I was saying, we'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, I have been Jerzy Drozd of, what is it, leanintoart.com, Jerzy Drozd on Instagram.
which project? Yeah. And thank you, Jerzy. Just want to say thank you explicitly for another year of podcasting with me, another calendar year, right? And thank you from the bottom of my heart to all the leaners, the people who download this and comment and interact. I deeply appreciate that as well, of course. So and I've also been of leanintoart.com and you can find me on the internets as just my name, Rob Stenzinger, Twitter, Instagram.
Okay, bye.
Show notes for this episode can be found at leanintoart.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at the user leanintoart, and you can reach us via email at leanintoart@gmail.com. And remember, leaners aren't wieners. Thanks for listening.
All right, I'm going to turn off the live stream. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.